Chapter 11, Data Classification and Handling Policies and Risk Management Policies. Let's review Chapter 11, Learning Objective and Key Concepts. The learning objective includes you need to describe the different information system security policies, and the key concepts include data classification and handling policies, business risk related to information systems, risk and control self-assessment, or RCSA, and risk assessment policies, quality assurance, or QA, and quality control, QC. Data classification policies. Labeling data. This is a very important activity. You need to identify the value of data by classifying it with labels, so people can find it quickly, so it is handled properly, and you do not overclassify data. You see that all the time in the government service. Clearly and simply represent how you want the data to be handled. And then when is data classified or labeled? You classify only the most important data, not the grocery list, not when you're going to pick up Bubba, okay? This is classified data by storage location or point of origin. And then you need to classify data at time of creation or use. The need for data classification. 3 needs. First is protect information, often referred to as security classification. It helps define the authentication and authorization levels to protect the information. Then you have retain information. Define retention policies. Retain only data that is needed to conduct business, and delete data that is no longer needed for legal or business reasons. And thirdly, recover information. Classification identifies mission-critical data that needs to be recovered quickly in case of a disaster. Legal classification schemes. Stanford University has adopted this data classification scheme. Prohibited information. Information is classified as prohibited if law or regulation requires protection of the information. Restricted information. Information is classified as restricted if it would otherwise qualify as prohibited, but it has been determined by the university that prohibiting information storage would significantly reduce faculty, staff, or student effectiveness. Confidential information. Information is classified as confidential if it is not considered to be prohibited or restricted, but is not generally available to the public. And then lastly, unrestricted information. Information is classified as unrestricted if it is not considered to be prohibited, restricted, or confidential. Those of you that are veterans will be acquainted with this one. Military Classification Schemes 1 of 3, page 1 of 3. The U.S. Military Classification Scheme is defined in National Security Information Document, Executive Order EO 12356. Let's start with the top secret. Data that the unauthorized disclosure would reasonably expect to cause grave damage to the national security. Secret. Data that the unauthorized disclosure would reasonably expect to cause serious damage to the national security. And confidential. Data that the unauthorized disclosure would reasonably expect to cause damage to the national security. Continue with page 2 of Military Classification Schemes. Unclassified data has 2 classified levels: sensitive but unclassified, confidential data not subject to release under the Freedom of Information Act, and unclassified data available to the public. In the last page of Military Classification Schemes, the government routinely declassifies data. This is handled in one of 3 programs run by the Information Security Oversight Office, ISOO. Automatic declassification automatically removes the classification after 25 years. Systematic declassification reviews those records exempted from automatic declassification. And then mandatory declassification reviews specific records when requested. Business classification schemes. First is highly sensitive, which means mission-critical data. You could shut down or be out of business if you don't have this data. Next is sensitive, data that is important but not vital to the business mission. And then internal, data not related to the core business. And public, data that has no negative impact on the business when released to the public. Developing a customized classification scheme. You can often create a customized classification scheme by altering an existing one. Federal agencies cannot customize a scheme. This is because their classification schemes are mandated by law. Many security frameworks provide guidance and requirements to develop a classification. Some sources of guidance and requirements include the International Organization for Standardization, Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology, and Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. Then we have you need to determine the number of classifications. Then you have to define each classified level. Then you have to name each classification level. Then we move on to you have to align classification to specific handling requirements, and then define the audit and reporting requirements. Classifying your data, page 1 of 2. Data ownership, accountable for defining data handling requirements. And data owner should be senior, accountable, able to balance between protection and usability. Then security controls, authentication method, encryption, monitoring, and logging. Page 2, classifying your data. Determining the security controls for each classification level is a core objective of data classification. It would make no sense to identify data as highly sensitive or top secret and then allow broad access. The data owner and IT department determine what controls are appropriate. The following is a sampling of the security controls to be considered. Authentication method, two-factor, ID password for internal network access, none for external public access. These are used in different areas. So let's look at this real quick. In data classification, you have high sensitivity, authentication, two-factor. Like you put in a password, then they send you a code through your phone. Then you got security controls, monitoring, real-time alerts, and logging, detailed logs. Sensitive, you have also the two-factor authentication. Monitoring is a daily log review, and logging supports monitoring for forensic use. And internal, ID password, login, log review in response to event, and logging is for forensic use. And then you got public, ID password for internal network access, none for external public access, and none for security under security controls. And then you have logging, you have log who updates the data and when it is updated. Data handling policies. Define access requirements based on who needs to use the information. Then assign data handling policies that define how data is to be used, and protect your data when it is moved. And data owner must consider both business and regulatory requirements. The need for policy governing data at rest and in transit, page 1 of 2. The majority of states have privacy laws that fall under two types of encryption requirements. First is laws that require private data to be encrypted. And then there's secondly laws that require notification of breaches when private data is not encrypted. Database encryption attack scenarios. 11-1 is the figure. It illustrates both points of view. There are two scenarios presented. In both scenarios, a hacker breaches the environment. In scenario number 1, a breach of the application leads to unencrypted data being exposed. In this case, encryption was of no value in protecting the information. In scenario number 2, a breach of the operating system leads to a database file being stolen. In this case, the data remained encrypted, which significantly helped prevent the data from being exposed. Encryption of data within the network can offer valuable protection depending on the type of breach. The key factor is whether the encryption key becomes exposed in the process. The need for policy governing data at rest in transit. You got encryption security policies. Encryption keys must be separated from encryption data. Encryption keys must be retrieved through a secure process. Administrator rights at the OS layer do not give access to the database. And the reasons for the lack of compliance: confusion over the laws, cost to comply, lack of standardized approach among vendor products. Policy, standards, and procedures covering the data lifecycle, page 1 of 2. Policies, standards, and procedures must be defined regarding data during the next 4 items. Creation. During creation, data must be classified. That could be simply placing the data within a common storage area. Next is access. Access to data is governed by security policies. Special guidance is provided on separation of duties, or SOD. Use. Use of data includes protecting and labeling information properly after its access. And then transmission. Data must be transmitted in accordance with policies and standards. Policies, standards, and procedures covering the data life cycle. Storage. Storage devices of data must be approved. This ensures that access to the device is secured and properly controlled. Physical transport. Transport of data must be approved. You just can't decide, a lower level worker just can't decide to transport. It has to have higher approval. This ensures that the data leaves the confines of the private network and is protected and tracked. The destruction. Destruction of data is sometimes called disposal. When an asset reaches its end of life, it must be destroyed in a controlled procedure. Identifying business risk related to information systems. Risk management policies establish processes to identify and manage risk to the business. Common risk policies include: consider the value of the data, that is, data classification, identify types of risk, measure impact to the business, and provide effective measurement through quality control and quality assurance. Types of risk. Operational. Any event that disrupts the activities the organization undertakes daily. An interruption of the technology that affects the business process. And then we move to physical, environmental, and technical hazards. These include physical, any physical threat such as a fire within the data center. Secondly, environmental, a storm or an earthquake. Or lastly, a technical, which means general category that covers other types of hazards. And then another last type of risk is financial. Potential impact when the business fails to meet its financial obligation. Data classification of volume versus time to recovery. This is illustrated by figure 11-2. And this illustrates that the point with Tier 1 representing mission-critical applications. With mission-critical applications, data should be mirrored so it can be recovered quickly. Development and need for policies based on risk management. Benefits of a risk management approach to security policies. Identifies possible cost and benefits of the decision. Considers actions that may not be apparent to the leaders and forces alternative thought, and provides analytic rigor to ensure an objective consideration of the risk. Risk management continuous improvement model. Risk management is a process of governance. It's also a continuous improvement model. Figure 11-3, depicted here, is a simple continuous improvement model for risk management. The following steps are cycled through each time a new risk is discovered. Prioritize the risk. Align the risk to strategic objectives. Identify an appropriate risk response. Sometimes this may require adjusting policies. Monitor the effectiveness of the response. Engage the reduction in risk. Identify residual and new risk whereby the cause of the risk is determined, and assess the risk to measure the impact to the organization. Risk and Control Self-Assessment, RCSA, is an effective tool in the risk management arsenal. It allows the organization to understand its risk and their potential effects on the business. It's a formal exercise many organizations conduct annually. An RCSA can be a time-consuming exercise, requiring engagement from the business's senior leadership and technology teams. However, the benefits are enormous. By the end of the day, a common view emerges on the challenges and risks that face an organization, including what the major known risks are, which of these risks will limit the ability of the organization to complete its mission, what plans are in place to deal with these risks, and who owns the management and monitoring of these risks. Risk assessment policies. A risk assessment is one of the most important activities that an organization performs. A risk assessment defines threats and vulnerabilities and determines control recommendations. It allows the organization to make informed decisions to invest in risk reduction. Risk-based decisions are the basis of most IT security policies. Risk exposure. A risk exposure is the impact to the organization when an event occurs. There are several ways to calculate risk exposure. Ideally, you want to quantify it with business terms such as putting a dollar value on the losses. A general accepted formula can be used to calculate exposure as follows, and it shows you the formula there on the screen. Then you have prioritization of risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. When you combine the risk exposure and business impact analysis, BIA, you can see the direct impact on the business. The view of risk allows you to prioritize the risk. A risk management program creates a balance between reducing the most likely events and mitigating risk with the greatest impact. Then you have the prioritization of risks, threats, and vulnerabilities, and you have that formula there, where risk exposure plus business impact analysis, BIA, equals direct impact on the business. Then you prioritize the risk to limit vulnerabilities and reduce breaches. Just a repeat there of my initial overview there. Thank you. Risk management strategies, 1 of 2. Risk avoidance, not engaging in certain activities that can incur risk. Then risk acceptance, accepting the risk involved in certain activities and addressing any consequences that result. Risk transference, sharing the risk with an outside party. And risk mitigation, reducing or eliminating the risk by applying controls. Risk management strategies, page 2. Risk management policies promote a series of efforts that allow an organization to be always self-aware of risk. Threat and vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, monitoring of systems, applications and networks, monitoring of vendor alerts on vulnerabilities, active patch management, effective vendor management and oversight, and aggressive risk and security awareness. Vulnerability assessments. Assessment tools and techniques. A vulnerability scan of a network, a scan of the source code of an application, a scan of an operating system's open ports. Then security policies define when and how to perform a vulnerability assessment. Scope the assessment, identify dependencies, perform automated testing, analyze and generate reports, and assign a rating. Vulnerability windows. Close vulnerabilities quickly once they're discovered. Work quickly with vendors and in-house development teams to identify fixes. Common vulnerabilities scan tools are Nmap, Nessus, OWASP Zap, patch management, you have vetting, prioritization, implementation, post-implementation assessment. Quality assurance versus quality control. You have quality control, or QC, an evaluation to indicate needed corrective responses, the act of guiding a process in which variability is attributable to a constant system of chance causes. Then you have QA, or quality assurance, the act of giving confidence, the state of being certain, or the act of making certain. Best practices for data classification and risk management policies include: keep the classification simple, no more than 3 to 5 data classes. Ensure that data classes are easily understood by employees, and name each classification level. And then data classification must highlight which data is most valuable to the organization. Classify data in the most effective manner that classifies the highest risk data first. Case studies and examples. Private sector, you have Microsoft Windows computers. WannaCry virus. Okay, it was a big virus that happened to Microsoft. A patch was available when the virus hit. Only organizations without the patch were affected, illustrating the need for appropriate patch management. Then you got the public sector. University of Texas, release of data classification standard, got out, okay? Then you got classifications of categories, 1, 2, and 3 is an example of a customized data classification scheme that the university determined to be sufficient to meet regulatory requirements. Thirdly, you have the private sector, including was Capital One. Example is Capital One. 30 gigabytes of credit card customer data were downloaded. Several policy failures ensued. Monitoring internal access, ensuring proper server configuration, and encrypting data at rest. In summary, we looked at data classification and handling policies, business risks related to information systems, risk and control self-assessment, or RCSA, risk assessment policies, quality assurance, QA, and quality control, QC. Thank you for listening to this PowerPoint.